I think you can teach those medical students and the residents some about the business, but honestly, I think the best thing you can teach them is like know who, like your who versus your how, you know what I mean? So it's like know who to put in that place.
From the basement to the boardroom, from ideas to innovation, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you'll encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this episode of Beyond Clean, we speak with Brian Segre, foot and ankle surgeon currently working in a clinical research and education specialist role. And Hank, this is going to be such a fun one, especially because I know you love art, you love to read, and we're going to be talking about the balance of art and science and the burden of perfection that may lay upon surgeons who really do, as you'll learn in this discussion today, have to take a very artistic and flexible approach. Not everything is laid right out for them step by step on a checklist. Tons of themes here coming at you and just a great season. And I promise you a phenomenal guest in this interview.
That's right, Justin. I would classify Brian as kind of a Renaissance man. If you're not familiar with that phrase and what that means, just listen to the interview because you're about to find out. And, getting that insight straight from the surgeons on this topic in particular, because we do view ourselves. Well, let me give you a side note. My first job was at the Subway sandwich, right? We were not called employees. We were called sandwich artists. And I've remembered that my entire career, like it was on our shirts. It says sandwich artist. That gave me a level of, confidence in building sandwiches that I don't think every fast food place had. And we know in sterile processing that there's a large part of our job that takes more skill than just what the certification textbook says, right? There are critical thinking decisions that you love to bring up on those topics that we got to think through. We got to make those wise decisions. Well, the same is true for surgeons. And we're going to dig into that on this episode today with Brian.
One of my favorite art forms is physical comedy. So I would not have been a good sandwich maker, I don't think.
Wow.
Don't go anywhere, everybody. Up next, Brian Segre.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Brian Segre, foot and ankle surgeon currently working in a clinical research and education specialist role. And Brian, as you know, we just love the online presence. We love influencers and we love having them on the show. And this whole season is dedicated to surgeons, and we're reaching the sterile processing audience and really appreciate you coming on the show to share your perspectives today.
Yeah, and I'm really excited. I mean, Hank and I connected a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months ago now, and have a lot in common with our background. And, I love what you guys are doing, not just in the surgical space and in the medical field, but, shining a light somewhere that it needed to be shined a long time ago. And so I look at you guys, honestly, and the girls and what y'all do behind the scenes as so integral to what we do, when we're actually in the OR. And I think it's just missed a lot. And so to see it here in this kind of presence is just awesome.
Well, Hank always comes up with some pretty cool titles for these. And I think one thing that would probably be surprising for the general consumer is that, there is a lot of art to surgery. And while there is plenty of science behind it, I think it's really that art piece has been unexplored. And I can't wait to dive into that part from your perspective, because, sometimes everybody's like, everybody's got everything figured out, right? Until it hits the fan and you've got to call an audible. And that's especially when the art of surgery comes into play. So I know you're working in a research and education role, which also aligns really well with us because we love education here. But can you talk about your background, how you got into surgery, and even looking at your LinkedIn profile, you have so many varied and interesting sort of business opportunities and experience as well. Like, you obviously like variety.
Yes. Yeah. Basically, when I was younger, I had some challenging stuff that I unfortunately saw. A really young, friend of mine who, when I was like 12, 13 years old, I happened to be the first person that had, come upon him after he had committed suicide. And so this was something that was really impactful to me when I was young, because it motivated me to want to take care of people. So I literally put my head down, and for the rest of my life, it was like medical school, residency, fellowship, become a surgeon, just books. And so I did that, and I got through, and I was very young, became the residency director at a level 1 trauma center, and was sort of living the dream, very happy. And then my dad lost his life to his second round of lung cancer. And literally, this is where the variety comes in. My mom and him had a family run business for like 50 years in San Antonio, this big company throughout the state. And mom and him, high school sweethearts and everything, she was really having a rough time. And so my wife and I had just bought like a house right in Northern Virginia, this big, beautiful red brick. And literally 2 months into it, this all happens. And I basically walked away from my career, came back and took over the company as like the president of the company. And my brother and I grew the company, from like doing, 3 to 5 a year to doing like 8 to 12. And then basically we're able to, during COVID, service companies and trade companies took off because everybody was at home. Right. And so all their stuff was breaking. They were wanting to remodel. They weren't at their commercial workspace. And so it was really good for our business. And so, yeah, it was amazing. I tell people I went from surgery, which is fluid running through pipes, to plumbing, which is also fluid running through pipes, and sort of did a 360, right? And it gave me this really cool perspective that a lot of surgeons, I think, don't have, where I got to see everyone from the trades, plumbing, AC, electrical, all the way up to the professor, right? And so it really I wish I had the information that I had now when I was still actually practicing, because I was a clinician and a professor then, and I think I would have been much more impactful as someone who was speaking. Honestly, us in medicine and surgery are very sheltered into that field. And when I left that field, it was like my eyes were just wide open, And so I know it's sort of a rant, but my background is kind of wacky. So most people want to hear the story, so I share it. And sometimes I can't believe it either. So
I kind of want to ask about that being thrust into leading a business, especially a business you didn't necessarily know a lot about, or maybe you had a lot of exposure to. But I think we all know when we start to launch a business, or in your case, you get thrust into leading a business, there are all these things that are the business of business that you get sheltered from, like you were talking about. So I understand sort of leading, and you're working with people who are, providing a trade and are doing the plumbing, and that's like, top to bottom in the organization exposure. But I also just wonder, even away from the people piece, how much did that give you a sense of the business of healthcare that you hadn't been exposed to before too?
A lot. It's amazing how you described it like perfectly, like the soft skills from, being a director, teaching residents and students, like translated so well. Like the organizational type stuff, as you mentioned, the people stuff, super easy. But all the stuff, I'll never forget the first time I like oversaw payroll, right? For like 100 plus people. My mom is like laughing at me, and she's like, how is this so hard for you? You have like calculus, organic chemistry 3, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, Mom, I get one paycheck. There's like 100 paychecks. I don't know what any of this stuff is, so that was the stuff that I think I was sheltered away from, at this big trauma center. I didn't do any of my own billing. I didn't do any of my own ordering. And so now all of a sudden I'm ordering for the warehouse. I'm overseeing, the different locations. And honestly, I think for me, that trial by fire was probably the best way to learn. I had my brother there with me, he's got an MBA, so he kind of would make me look good in situations where I probably didn't. But yeah, it was it was definitely a journey. That's for sure.
So it's funny. We talk a lot on Beyond Clean about the sterile processing leader that gets promoted up through the ranks as a technician, as a supervisor, and they're really good at the technical. And then they get into that management chair and they're handed this multi-million-dollar budget and said, like, go save money, improve the quality, drive efficiencies. And yet they haven't had any of that training. And I've never thought once until you just described your experience that our surgeons, while very smart and very good at a number of things, especially in their specialty, they may not know a lot about business at all.
Oh,
and yet
terrible.
They're also responsible for, potentially like a service line worth millions. Like how?
Correct.
I don't want to get us too off track, but is there a solution to that besides just adding more curriculum into the medical program, which it's already crammed enough? Like, how do we teach surgeons that?
It is. I will say they are, just like there's this big push in the space for exposing this physician burnout, all this different mental health and medicine. There is more curriculum going in now in the business space. I will say, though, honestly, starting out a private practice nowadays, like totally solopreneur, entrepreneur, is so, honestly, if I was going to do that in this space today, I think part of my budget would literally be like, whether it was a lawyer, a CPA, I would have to have somebody that was like advising me, because now just there's so much red tape and the space is it's so different. I think you can teach those medical students and the residents some about the business, but honestly, I think the best thing you can teach them is like know who, like your who versus your how, you know what I mean? So it's like know who to put in that place.
Yeah. I forget the other author of the book, but Who Not How is,
yes.
Yeah, a book I think I read last summer. So yeah, that's a great takeaway there. Pulling us back in, right, to the art and science. I know something that caught my eye early on when we got connected was you're into art. Outside of just the surgical arts, you're also just into art in general. So kind of start us there. I just mentioned there's not a lot of, business training in healthcare and in the surgical training, but how do these schools approach the art of surgery, like Justin mentioned? Is that something that can be trained into people? Is it just a natural affinity that there are more artistic surgeons versus more, scientific surgeons? How would you approach that?
I would say, I think for me, like my background came from, as I was sort of thinking about medicine as a career, I was actually going to art. I was going to go to art school. Like that was my, I was like trained artist, like was going to go to art school. And basically, not to be funny, but having a dad and growing up in Southern Texas, my dad basically said, if you go to that fancy art school in New York, you might as well just take everything with you because you're on your own, and all
that's like
aside,
the Willie Nelson songs, like, doctors and
yes,
lawyers. That's your option.
That's your option. So, my dad is the plumber. I listen to what he says, right? So when he told me that, I said, I'll go to Texas A&M, Dad. That's fine. I'll be a doctor. Yeah. So for me, like I was already interested in it. And I think that it's funny because a lot of surgeons do draw a lot like with planning, and a lot of them actually are very technically talented, like as a draftsman, like let's say an architect or an engineer would be. But I think where you're headed, Hank, is like, I think as an artist, one of the things that I'm trained to remember the most is all these people like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, all these famous artists, they talk about how the one thing that let them be so creative and so well and good at what they did was they never lost their childlike curiosity. So I think for me, like the difference between someone who may be technically really talented or able to draw, but someone who is like an artist is that person is always, their mind is always going somewhere maybe that someone else's wouldn't in a curious way, or they're always thinking about something from a different side. So I talk a lot about on LinkedIn about like going outside into nature and just looking at what nature has to offer. And honestly, if you study, like just sit outside and just study what you see, you'll start to see things from like an artistic side. You know what I mean? I think we stare at a screen all day long, and what you see all day is something that's flat, that's trying to look three-dimensional. But the world, your eyes are trained to see the actual three dimensions, right? So I think like we lose a lot of spatial awareness because we stare at a flat screen all day, but life isn't flat.
All right, I'm going to start hooking myself up to my Oculus while I'm doing work then.
Yes, do it.
I don't think that's what Brian's getting at.
I know. That was tongue in cheek. So,
but you see what I mean, though.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean. And, I just feel like we're tied to that computer too, right? And so like the reality is that a lot of that artistic part of our minds is getting muted. And I wonder, and I'm going to kind of preface this with a brief story about a friend, but I wonder how much they're actually looking for and recruiting people with some sort of artistic capability into the field specifically. So I have a friend who's a dentist and he has his own practice, and he was telling me that when he applied to Temple for dental school, that, he didn't have the best grades. And so he was looking for a way to stand out. And he used to love in high school doing like models of planes and cars and all this detail work. And a big part of being a dentist is modeling and doing 3D modeling. And so he used that as sort of a transferable skill. And he did do a lot of those by scratch. And so when I heard him talk about that, I thought, oh, what a creative way to kind of get noticed, especially when your grades aren't like top of the line. But then the other thing that I thought about was, yeah, there's an art to this. And they recognized that he had that artistic skill. Do you think schools recognize that and look for that? I know they say well-rounded, but are they specifically looking for people with some sort of artistic background or inclination?
They definitely weren't when I was there. I mean, they were looking for that, blanket term, well-rounded. I know now with a lot of testing, they're looking definitely a lot more like not just it's straight artistic stuff, but more like dexterity and stuff like this, where it may have sort of a link to that.
But that's fine motor skill. That's still not artistic expression.
They're really not. And, I think there's a female surgeon, a neurosurgeon on LinkedIn, Catherine Coe. She's like awesome. She's a fine art trained surgeon as well as a neurosurgeon. And, she is very, thinks just like I do in the sense that they're really not screening for this. And I'm not saying that it's like a requirement, but when we get into more of these other questions and more of these other topics, I definitely think that you guys will see that in these tight, difficult, challenging scenarios that I used to be in, at least in the operating room, it's almost like an out-of-body experience where I'm literally not thinking about anything from a textbook at all. And it's all just like intuition and really just being in the moment right then. And I think that some of that you can teach and really some of it you can't. But if you can identify it, right, even if you can't teach it, if you can identify those skills or maybe heighten them or bring them up a little bit, yeah, then I'm right on board with you. But I think we need to find a way to be able to do that.
So that's a perfect setup. I know we talked before we came online about the author and surgeon Atul Gawande and just all the wonderful books that he's written. Complications is the one that I'm particularly going to ask you about, but I was actually introduced as a young sterile processing manager to his checklist Manifesto. And that's the thing that kind of woke me up, because I was like all about trying to move away from all the documentation. I was like, we're writing everything now. Like we need to like get away from these checklists. And then I read that book and I was like, oh yeah. Okay. So checklists have a place and a very important place. So we've talked about that before in the podcast, but this question is specific to another one of those kind of challenging the status quo assumption out there in the public of this idea of the practice of medicine. So we still call it practicing medicine, but in his book, he kind of went through a couple of chapters there of, this is a human art. And in
an experiment,
any human art, you have to practice in order to get better. That means that at many times in your clinical experience as a patient, you are getting treated, but you're also being practiced upon. So can you kind of speak to that? This may be a new concept, right, for many folks tuning in and maybe have never understood that or even thought about this concept. So how does that impact those moments, even as you mentioned, of you're in the surgery? Now you're drawing from everything that you've been taught, but then you're also needing to draw from this creative side, critical thinking. How does all that meld together?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because, Hippocrates, people know the Hippocratic Oath. I mean, this is a very old principle that a lot of ancient and old philosophers and practitioners of medicine talked about. That's where the term practitioner came from. It's truly, I don't think that we will ever do anything other than practice medicine, because no matter how you think all of this that is came to be, clearly we are very complex and we truly don't understand how all these parts work together yet. And even though we think we do, and we have the DNA and we have this micro DNA and all this stuff, it's still, what we found is that you can test stuff in a lab, but when you put it into the actual body, it interacts in a synergistic way that is not reproducible, right? And so you're absolutely right. I think that this, the public doesn't maybe understand, like, well, what do you mean they're practicing, right? So obviously things are structured. There's educators there's safety checks, as you mentioned, and these are all very stringently adhered to. But yes, I mean, there is a sense where I, as a surgeon, never felt like I had a perfect case. I don't know if you ever want to feel that way, right? Because I have to keep myself a little bit uncomfortable so that I can stay humble and so I can keep my humility. And that's what makes me grow and want to be better. If I get this narcissistic, type A surgeon personality where, I think I walk on water, like, that guy from Nip Tuck, that old show. And it's like, you think you're just so great. Then the problem is that that's when the errors and the mistakes start to happen, because you're not keeping yourself a little bit uncomfortable so that you're very keen as to what's going on. And
you deny the mistakes.
So
you're also not addressing them. You're compounding them.
You are. And then and there's no system issue that gets fixed. There's no protocol that gets put in place or taken out of place. We always want to put protocols in, but sometimes they need to be taken out too. So I always like to mention that. But anyways, so you're totally right. And I think as an artist or someone who has that eye, it's sort of, you learn to see things like before they even happen, right? Because as an artist, when you're painting or you're drawing, you learn to use the eraser or to make mistakes very early on, right? If you never attack like a blank sheet of paper or a blank canvas and never make a mistake, you'll never make a masterpiece. And so I think, like, we're trained as an artist to learn that things go wrong. And when they go wrong, how do you make them better, right? And so I think if you come at surgery from that perspective, right, that something is going to go wrong, it's nothing that is bad, it's nothing that affects the outcome or gives the patient a bad result. But if you go in there with the mentality that everything is, like, quote, surgical and surgical precision, right, that's not really how it is. It's like any other job, right? And so I think that for me, it's like staying curious, staying creative, and knowing that it's not if things are going to go wrong, it's when, right? And just being prepared so that when it happens, you remain calm.
You're really teeing up this kind of next line of questioning for us around that balance of perfection, which is an ideal that really can't be attained, right? And then yet at the same time, this is on a continuum or a spectrum where on one end of the spectrum, it's like, yeah, you want to stay humble, but you don't want to be humbled by things that happen during surgery that wind up having a negative impact, right? So there's kind of like this little area with which you wiggle in that this is the safe place. Like, we know it's going to be a little bit different. It's not always going to be perfect, but in the end, there's the minimum threshold line where we know there's no negative impact to the patient. It's just, man, if I had just done this technique a little bit differently this way, I'd be that much closer to perfection next time. But
exactly,
there's a burden in that room, and the Hippocratic Oath is definitely part of it. But especially, I can see why that character was created on Nip Tuck that you're talking about. Is if I can attain this perfection and I have this wall, then I never have to deal with the emotional burden of the potential consequences of making a mistake, right? And so that's what they're building, is this wall around their ego integrity. And so how do you maintain that balance where you get enough humility where it doesn't sack your confidence and keeps you on that strive towards perfection, and at the same time saying to yourself, I know I'm not going to attain it. I know it's not reasonable to attain it, but I must always try to get there.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I do. So I have this, a lot of people know this, like, perfectly imperfect, right? So like for me, I always try to think to myself that, like, perfection or whatever it is that we're chasing, right, it's not real. It's an idea, because if anything's ever perfect, then it's done and it's over. So there's nowhere else to go after that. So I think for me, that's, I think a lot of surgeons are very procedural based, but they're very, like, every time I do this procedure, I cut it this way, the screw's this long, I use this plate, right? And so everything to them is like bump, 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 right? It's like A, B, C. And the problem is that every human, every anatomy, every person, everything is always different. And so for me, like, a lot of people have templates and standards. And so I think you have to be very careful how structured you try to make the process, because not everyone is the same. I'm not saying that I don't have like an idea or a concept. If it's an ankle fracture, right? If it's a midfoot fracture or whatever, I know that I have, like, I'm going to go through the same process, like Nate mentioned, the same checklist, but I never am so rigid to that where if I know in a specific instance, okay, this particular case needs this, right? So I think the way I keep myself like always striving to perfection is knowing that whatever I did last time might not apply here. So don't go into that case thinking I'm going to just do it like I did last time, because that's when you let your guard down and that's when you have a problem. So for me, I always remind myself, like right before I go into the operating room, right, as I'm like sterile and going in to get ready, the first thing I tell myself is like, this person is unique and different. I would like always tell myself that, just so I would know it's not a cookie cutter case.
That's really cool. And the way that you're approaching the process versus, and respecting like anatomy being one example of how every case is going to be different. Each person is going to be different. One of the things that we've talked a lot about from a leadership perspective in dealing with people is to really start with the process. Where did the process, fail us as an entire team, right? And so I can almost see like, and you can tell me this, but I can see a strategy where, yes, you look at your technique and you say, next time maybe, in this scenario with this kind of anatomy or this anomaly, I might do this a little bit differently. But I can also see where those checklists and those processes and the way that the procedures are done, that's also what drives innovation. Like you probably also look at it and say, the processes and the tools and the products and everything else that we have available to us is also not perfect. It's not just about me, and moving out of that and saying, I think if we had a device that did this, or if I could just stabilize this in a new way that technology can't support me on now, that I would be able to do this with more precision. Is that another way that a lot of people deal with that? I need to improve without kind of hampering their confidence? Do you feel like that exists, or does that only exist in a certain population of innovators that think that way naturally?
No, I definitely think it exists. And honestly, I think sometimes that we're actually looking at it the wrong way, in the sense that like a lot of people talk about automation technology, right? Like all these 3D printed custom, for total joints and for, 3D cages for trauma and all this stuff. And so the way I look at it is people, I don't want to say the average person, but a lot of people assume that as things become more automated and technology becomes more advanced, that the person has to think less because the machine, the device, the product is doing it for them. And I think people who are really innovators, or people who are sort of thinking outside the box, what I realize, or what they realize, is that process becomes automated because it's a mundane routine task, which then allows me as the actual human to execute my critical higher level thinking that machine is never going to be able to do. That machine might be able to read 1 million x-rays and detect a cancer quicker than a radiologist. I get that. But there's still things that the machine, the automation is never going to be able to do. And so I don't look at it as taking my process over. I look at it as it's freeing my process up. It's taking something that's really mundane that I don't need to waste time with. And it's giving me now the ability to innovate and critically think and use the part of my brain that I should be using, and let it worry about the mundane checklist task.
Yeah, that reminds me, in January of this past year, 2022, we did a symposium on robotics and automation in sterile processing. And one of the themes that came up was, automation is really looking toward the dirty, the dull, and the dangerous. Those are the things that they want to automate. Not, to your point, everything that a human actually enjoys doing. Not only are we better at it, but we enjoy the things. They're not dirty, dull, and dangerous. So yeah, that's a great takeaway just from the perspective, again, of the surgeon. I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question, though, of a surgeon who's got the artistic nature. And this is kind of coming from the sterile processing perspective. And, it's interesting, too, now with your experience at trades. I didn't really put this together, too, so you can kind of speak from wherever on it. But in your surgical trades, obviously, in some sense, those are tools. They're like a hammer or a screwdriver. And, quite literally, hammer and screwdriver. And in another sense, they're kind of paintbrushes, right? And you're the anatomical artist. How do you approach that, looking at those tools or looking at those paintbrushes in what you need to do your job as the artist and as the scientist, and that balance, going back to what Justin asked before, like you're balancing this with the competing pressures of the financial side of every surgeon can't have every style of paintbrush they want or every tool they want. Like, how do you approach that?
It's sort of, I was lucky, growing up like I did out on the ranch. We talked about it a little bit before we came on. I grew up like swinging an axe, repairing stuff, using tools. And so I think for me, I look at it as like an extension of my hand, right? Just like a pencil or a paintbrush or any other tool. I think, people look at an instrument or they look at any other piece of equipment in the operating room and they think of it just as that, as like a tool. But I really think of whatever you're holding as like an extension of your actual arm, right? And so, yeah, I think for me, it was always about efficiency in the operating room, meaning I didn't need like the fanciest stuff. I had like certain things that I liked, but it was always about if I picked up a tool or an instrument, I wanted to use it as for everything that I needed, like before I put it down, because everything adds time in the operating room and that adds anesthesia risk, which really is the biggest risk to the patient in the operating room is general anesthesia. And so that's what we talk about when we say we want to get the patient off the table. We don't want to rush and compromise the outcome, but I am always thinking about anesthesia time. And so that was just something that I learned early on, was always trying to be efficient with the instrument. And I think, as you mentioned, as an artist or as a paintbrush versus a tool, it also makes me think of certain types of stuff that I do, still with my art. That paint dries very quickly, or if it's watercolor, once the water starts to dry on the paper, then it changes the way the paint flows. And so it all is always reminding me of efficiency and just making sure that when you pick up the instrument, it's the right one and that you use it, obviously how it's designed, but like as an extension of yourself.
And, sometimes if it's not the right one, because we have those occasions in the trays where you don't have what you need, but you also don't have time to get what you need. And that's where the artistic, creativity goes into to make those clinical decisions. So our time has gone by like crazy, but I want to kind of wrap us up here on the practical takeaways, because I think there's been a lot of tremendous insight shared, getting into the mind of the surgeon. I think this episode, maybe more than any of the others on Q in this season, just how you guys and gals think has been really helpful for me. But speaking of that, as I kind of mentioned before, we've got a lot of sterile processing folks obviously tuning into Beyond Clean. And I'm just kind of curious on this topic of the burdens. Like, there is a lot of responsibility on the back of you surgeons. We kind of kid around about that. You get kind of anxious, sometimes get frustrated, but hey, there's some pretty good reasons for that. But in speaking to our audience, are there any kind of practical takeaways that you would recommend for us to think about or to do differently or to communicate differently as we work with our surgeons, or to try to balance this art and science of surgery?
Honestly, for me, and this may not be, I would say this is probably the best advice. It might not be always the most practical, but I think something that you guys do very well and is you're really direct. So I think a lot of people are scared. I don't know if the word scared is right, to talk to the surgeon, right? Or they're worried about this grumpy old surgeon. Oh, don't bother him. He's too busy, whatever. And so I think that like there may be some of that still around, but I think it's unfortunate because, younger surgeons, newer surgeons, people whose mindset has changed are realizing that, and I think this is where my career change made me realize that it's everyone literally from the top to the bottom. Like, I can't do what I do if nothing else is done beforehand. So the best advice I could give you guys is, if all of us want to have a better art and science experience at the end of the day for the patient, then I would say if you have a concern, if you have a question, like, it's all about how you deliver, but don't be worried or afraid to speak up, because just because you may not be in the operating room doesn't mean that you still can't, quote, stop the line, in a sense that if you think there's a better way, if you think there's a change that needs to be made. For me, I would entertain that in my operating room any day of the week, because I would take it as, hey, maybe I don't want to hear this. Maybe this is not like how I would have approached this, but I need to hear this because he has something that might make the care or the outcome for the patient better. So I need to listen, right? And so, yeah, I think that it's just open dialogue and just not being worried about what you say, but be worried about how you say it.
Well, Brian, I've really enjoyed this one. I honestly don't want it to end. I feel like this conversation could go on for another 30 minutes. And so who knows? I think we could definitely have you back again in the future. We've said that before and we've made good on it many a time as well. But, I want to encourage everybody to find you on LinkedIn. Definitely search and follow or make a connection with you. You're putting out great content, and I know nobody can see behind you, but I think we have a little bit of a look at some of your art potentially, as we're doing this interview. And
there's stuff. Yeah.
It's quite varied. A lot of times what you'll see with artists is they have one sort of way of doing things and they kind of stick to it and keep tweaking it. But even as I look at your art, it's quite different. You're experimenting with lots of different things. So just so they know, you don't just pretend to be an artist. I can see the artistic variation, even though they can't. And I want to thank you for sharing that artistic perspective on surgery with us today.
Of course. Yeah, I had a great time. I'm always happy to come back. And, again, I just want to make a point to say that before I came on LinkedIn, I did not know Hank. I didn't know that this, Beyond Clean, this sterile, obviously I knew about sterile processing, but I didn't know that it was a presence like this. And I wish I would have, because you guys honestly are like the warriors behind the scenes. And I just, so many cases I've done in the middle of the night that could have just never gone off if it wasn't for you guys. And so it's just my pleasure to be here. And I love that you guys are bringing this part of medicine that is so integral into the public eye to be seen by everybody. It's amazing.
That was Brian Segre, foot and ankle surgeon, currently working in a clinical research and education specialist role and running a plumbing business on the side. What a crazy story that is. His background in art, even the story about his father, it's sort of like, doctors and lawyers and such, as you quoted Willie Nelson.
That
definitely
song,
love that song.
I'm proud of you.
Yeah, I know that one on the guitar, Hank. So
that's great.
But yeah, I think, talking about that is really, it's very diverse, the background and the experiences. And, they really kind of lie on two sides, the business, which is sort of concrete and mathematical. And he talked about payroll. And then there's this artistic side, which is being flexible and malleable and using that sort of critical thinking and trying different brushstrokes. And then in the middle of that is, the procedure itself, and also being very present. The great thing about payroll is you can sit back and take a look at it and think about it for a while. And the great thing with art is the same. You can really take your time with it. But in surgery, as he mentioned, was thinking about the consequences of being under anesthesia. So there is also this high stress, high pace, every second counts kind of environment. And, all of that in his discussion around balancing it, and the balancing act that it is, I would think broad versus very myopic viewpoints would be a strength for a surgeon.
As you were talking about that, Justin, I was thinking, imagine the impact to art if we kind of set a timer on the artist, and if they didn't get the art done in time, someone could die. Okay. Like that's what they were painting or creating under. That's the pressure. I think the amount of masterpieces and the way that they looked would differ because artists, traditionally, to your point, they're not under that kind of stress. And yet our surgeons are. And I'm really glad that that came out in the interview. That was one of the things that I was really looking for. Like I kind of assumed it was true just because of the impact that we see culturally on the sterile processing side. But it was important to get out here in those two perspectives that you described that, yes, they're highly trained specialists and they know all the science side of it. And yet it's not that easy. It's not a formula. It's not a checklist. There are critical decisions all throughout the process that change with each patient, with each procedure. And that's why we got to cut these guys to break in the moments, where frustration leads to things or, even in areas again, where there's some disagreement around the tools. They're in the surgical trays and all the push for standardization. I think that's another topic that I'd love to draw out, maybe in a second interview with Brian down the road.
Oh, I'd like to talk about his practical takeaway, which is about speaking up. And he mentioned there are certain ways to approach that. I would love to hear some techniques for how to position feedback to a surgeon to get that kind of engagement from an area of expertise in sterile processing that might just not be there based on different roles, different, aspects to providing safe surgical care. So, all right, everybody, if you haven't downloaded our smartphone app, do it today. That's right. Go to the App Store or wherever you get your apps and search for the Beyond Clean podcast. Download it. We've got bonus content for some of these episodes. It's the best way to listen. But if you're already listening to podcasts on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, you can certainly find us there. And if you're there, we'd love a rating and a review because your feedback is important. But you can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. And honestly, there are so many podcast apps out there. It'd take me 20 minutes to list them all. So if you're using a different one, just search for the Beyond Clean podcast, subscribe, like it, share it with others. We would love that. We also love feedback, and the email is info@beyondclean.net. We want to know, was there an episode that had a big impact on you? We also want to know if you've got recommendations for themes for future seasons. This is a great theme for this season with surgeons. Absolutely. We want great other ideas. We've got over 200 podcasts in the book, and we keep cranking them out. And I bet you can think of a guest or a topic or a theme for a season that would really be an excellent idea. And we want to hear from you. Again, info@beyondclean.net. That's going to do it for this show. On behalf of Hank and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.